Yeah, so I want to talk about managing fires. So specifically, the leadership position role when you have an incident that gets beyond one person responding. How do we actually deal with managing that? So briefly about me, that's me. I am Crazy on Twitter, and that's how you spell it. If you spell it differently, you won't find me. I do DevOps consulting for Cage Data, and I'm organizing the DevOps Days Hartford. Our CFPs are open, so if you want to talk, submit a talk to Hartford. So great. So this is kind of a quote that comes up a lot in our company: "Never let a serious crisis go to waste," which sounds a little bit like taking advantage of a bad situation, but if you keep going through it, and he says, what I mean by that is that it's an opportunity to do things you think you could not do before. And this is really where we come into it. It's that opportunity around crisis that you find you can often make more headway in an issue due to that. And if nothing else, you can learn a lot from how you behave there. So this is the story of where it comes from. We actually had an incident response where things went really well for us. We were very happy with how it turned out. And we made sure to actually wrap a retrospective around that, right? Postmortems aren't just for when stuff breaks. If you do stuff really well, we want to learn from it too. So we had a customer who had some aging infrastructure. We helped with a lot of transitional and transformations. And we were helping them move to new systems. And we had an old system. It's a Windows environment. They had a lot in one basket that was running email and Active Directory and file shares and all of these things in one basket. And we knew it was going to fail, and eventually it did. Luckily, we had someone there. We were able to pick it up quick. It quickly moved from one person trying to make sure the system comes back online to all hands need to fix this now. And the opportunity we had in this moment is we actually had a lot of their new technology stack staged. And we had a moment there where we could decide to either try and recover from backups on the systems and get them back to where they were before, or actually push through this into new infrastructure and really bring them back ahead of where they were before this crisis happened. So that's what occurred. When we postmortemed it, we learned a lot of lessons about why it worked so well and how we were able to make those choices. And that's what I wanted to go through today. So for little incidents, we've got a lot of tools around this, and this is always where you want to start in incident management. Use what you've got available. Context is a big one. You know, when you have an alert come in or something's going wrong, we want to know what that affects. What things are actually going wrong in our systems? Do they have user impact? How big is the user impact? For us, knowing that that server meant all of the things were broken was a really big choice in deciding how to move forward and how to tackle it. We've got runbooks, right? I mean, that's probably the best example of a runbook I can find. If you have a small fire, right, follow these steps and hopefully it goes out. If not, maybe automation engines can kick in, and sometimes those take care of fires automatically. I've actually had other customers I've worked with that had a known issue, and they could build some automation around that kicking in. They had a leaky process, memory would leak. When they felt the back pressure on it, they just reboot the process and clean up the mess afterwards. It's not a permanent fix, but it lets them focus on coming up with resolutions in the future rather than having to constantly respond to the same thing. So those can kick in and help you for small incidents. Eventually, there should be an escalation process. And this should be a tool in your tool chest as well. It shouldn't just be something where you kind of vaguely know that you should call someone else when things are wrong. You should have concepts around what it means to escalate that and who you should contact. You know, this is actually an escalation process for wildfires, right? So this actually gives you some context around what does the escalation condition mean? How should you be reacting to that? You know, these are the kinds of things we want in an actual escalation process. So eventually, you're going to have an issue where you escalate and it requires a whole team. And if it requires a whole team, you really need some leadership wrapped around that. You know, when you're making group decisions, that's excellent. It makes sure a lot of voices are represented. You can hear a lot of feedback and make good decisions. If the health of your company is relying on how quickly you make those decisions, probably a committee isn't the best idea. This is actually, I was at DevOps Days Seattle, and Scott Nacello from Columbia was out there, and he used this concept in his talk. I actually from that one had a picture of his slide. I was like, oh, this is perfect. But I wanted to make it a little bit more visible. This is the be, know, do model of leadership from the US Army. And a lot of these concepts are very clear. When you're dealing with crisis management, there's a lot of really good concepts here. It doesn't play directly, but I wanted to key in onto some of the points that it's a servant leader. You've got to be a global communicator. You're seeking self-improvement. You need to know your people. You need to know when to be constrained by the doctrine, when to go away from it. And you want to make sure you're providing clear vision, not just vague commands, and doing things timely. So a lot of this applies, and I wanted to kind of have that in mind as we went through. So the first thing is you want to have a leader determined ahead of time. If you have a major crisis and now need to determine who the leader is, you probably have 2 crises that you're dealing with now, as a bunch of fighting over who should be in charge and the actual problem you have. So this should be determined ahead of time, whether it's a given manager in a situation. As it was in our case, we just had whoever was the senior member there stepped up. It's how it happens a lot with actual fire incident commanders. The more senior officers step up and become the incident commander. But it might be that you don't have that hierarchy in your organization. So it may be a rotating basis of, hey, when we're on call for this cycle, you're the incident commander if there is something. That needs to be determined ahead of time, so there's no question. And there's something to be said for sort of the ritual of setting apart an incident from regular operation. I'm a firm believer that we think and tell stories, and that's just how we operate. And so the reason we have ceremonies, like a graduation ceremony, is to set that moment apart from regular everyday life. It's not a normal thing. It's unique. Something is different about this. So even taking the time in an incident and just gathering everybody and say, hey, this is what's happening now. We're now in incident response mode. I am the incident commander. Just building that moment around it to set it apart from normal operations is worth doing just to sort of change the mindset that everyone's in for that moment. Those leaders should also be authorized to make business choices. If stuff is on fire and you have to determine, hey, we need to shut down access to our API because we are just getting overloaded and can't figure out what the real problem is, you're probably going to impact customers. That's probably going to have a financial impact. You need to be able to make that choice. If you have to determine that you need to take network traffic and get rid of it, shed it off your network, black hole some of those routes, you need to be able to make that choice without having to phone someone and wait 20 minutes for them to wake up and them to talk to 2 people. All of those choices are part of that MTTR, about recovering from problems. The other portion of that is that the leader's not doing this alone. That's kind of the key of having the team, is there's no one person. So when we're having more than one person work on a task, you want to let the people in charge of that task have as much autonomy and as much authority over it as possible. So for us, for instance, we had someone that needed to do file recovery. That person was fully in charge of that process. It wasn't, hey, I need you to do these specific steps in this specific order. It was, I need you to do file recovery, run by me what your plan is so we know and we can divide that up, but you're in charge of that, so that way you can get big picture as a leader and everyone else can kind of handle their own individual sections. So I hesitated calling this Troubleshooting 101, but it is kind of the basic thoughts that I wanted to get out in it. There's some basic concepts of standard operational troubleshooting you should know if you're commanding an incident. For instance, incrementalize everything, and this kind of applies to how we want to build software too, but when you're troubleshooting an incident, you want to look at all of the component pieces and how they fit together. Because it's probably one of those that's broken that then breaks the whole. So we need to kind of take it scientifically and experiment on each piece. I think this is actually a really good connection to how Mia talked about them troubleshooting the problem at PagerDuty with their network. They knew, big picture, they weren't getting communication end-to-end in their production network. But knowing all of the component pieces, that they had an IPsec network involved, that the packets have to go through a different MTU change, that they have all of these different component pieces, you can start experimenting on individual components and make sure they're not the thing breaking the problem. So that's a key thing, understanding how it breaks up and how it divides down. And a leader might not understand the whole system end to end, but that's why we have more than one person involved. You need to get that knowledge as much as possible. This is another thing. You want to know what will make it work. These are the workarounds. Sometimes this is the best solution to start with, because you know what? If I have to go to the bathroom, I can take care of it, and I can flush it, kind of. You may not want to do that for a long time, but it makes the operation work, and you can at least start moving forward and restore operations at that point. So there's another side to that. There's another concept of what will make it whole, right? So not just what will make it functional again, but what actually restores it back to how it was, or better than it was in our case. This might be a little bit different, right? Just restoring operations doesn't necessarily mean it works the right way or works pleasantly. So understanding there's a second process here, and knowing the time and effort of what goes into both of those, and the costs of going to a workaround. You know, sometimes implementing a workaround means it takes twice as long to get back to full operation, so there might be a choice to be made. And a lot of times it's implement workaround now and deal with restoration during normal business hours when everyone has a little more rest. So it's going to vary based on the situation, your organization, and what services you're providing. So this is a big one as well. As a leader, you're not just in charge of the whole operations, but you're kind of the overall information gatherer. You're trying to get big picture on everything. Because you set the tone for your team, you also set the tone on how your team communicates and interacts. This is a great quote that I like. If you know John Hodgman, he is an actor, comedian. He had a role playing a PC at one point during Mac and PC commercials. And now he is a fake internet judge dispensing fake internet justice. Judge John Hodgman podcast, and that's my small moment of buzz marketing. So he says, brevity is the soul of wit, and specificity is the soul of narrative. Again, this comes back to my storytelling concept. We tell stories about how we're doing work, and the more specific we are, the more we understand what's actually happening, the less we have questions about what's actually happening. So this goes to giving clear directions. If you need someone to do a specific thing in a specific way, you should tell them that information rather than assuming they're going to know how you want something done. A key component to that is making work very visible to everybody. Each person on your team is going to work a little bit differently, but we have a lot of tools for this. This is a key DevOps concept that applies specifically when everyone's trying to work in a high-stress environment. We've got a couple different tools here that are just very simple, relatively free to use. ChatOps is one of them. If you actually have the chatbots running and can actually do your recovery operations in chat, so much the better. Now everyone sees literally everything you're doing. But at least having that chat channel available that you can communicate in is key. You can spin up a Trello board. This is literally what we did when we had it. We spun up a Trello board for our component tasks of each. We broke it down incrementally. We had a big picture of what needed to happen, broke that down into smaller and smaller parts until we had individual tasks that could be completed. We would assign those to people, and they'd move it from waiting, in progress, to done. So we knew what people were working on. We knew what was completed. I didn't have to go around and ask everyone individually, hey, what's your status on this? Hey, what's your status on this? I had notes, and I had everything right there. Allows me to filter that through myself without interrupting people while they're trying to do some pretty heavy, relatively deep work here at the moment. So a lot of what the leader's doing here is not necessarily technical. It could be. I'm not going to say in your organization that your leaders aren't technical. Your incident commander may still also be an individual contributor, but their main goal here is to actually handle the interactions and the cohesion on your team. One of the challenges with being humans is that we run on actual ingestion of food products. So that's something you should think about. If you've got a long-term incident, your engineers are going to need to eat. And if they're making a bunch of high-stress business decisions at that moment, they probably don't also want to figure out where they want to order food from or what they're going to get or what there is. So if you can manage that and say, hey, it's been a while, we should get some food, and have some sort of generic order you can put in, and just, instead of saying, what do you want to eat, being able to say, here is some food when you're hungry, is a big change in the cognitive load that an engineer has to handle. They don't have to remove context. They don't have to make another decision on top of everything they're doing. Little things that can really help. If you've got remote workers involved, it's worth knowing if there's a place that delivers to them that you can order from. May not be possible, but it's worth something to consider. And I apologize for the sports metaphors inside of a tech conference, but it applies, right? You want to manage the people that you have available. If you have an incident that goes to all hands, you can't operate that for a very long time. Again, food and sleep are pretty consistent needs. And if you have everyone working 100%, they're going to run out of steam. At some point, everyone's going to need to sleep, and having everyone do that at once is a problem. You want to make sure you have people able to switch in. This was the most New England picture I could find that was still hockey, so. It was baseball before, but I figured it's appropriate to change it. You need to have people that can switch in. So we actually had this. Our incident went all hands on deck. Everyone was involved for at least the first maybe half hour, 45 minutes. And so we made a clear call, and we literally sent people home and said, look, I need you to go home because I need someone else available later. And you may want to help. Try and resist the urge. It's really good to help, but if you're working all night, and all of my team is working all night, I need someone to come in the next day. Having people actually work until they pass out is also not good. This contributes to a number of problems, but burnout is a major problem. You can't function like this for a long time. I think as engineers, we have a tendency to want to get in and problem solve. You want to just work a problem until completion. So as leaders, I have a person on my team that works like this. He wants to just work things to completion. So what I have to do is literally tell him to stop, like keep his computer from him when he goes home. Like, I really need you to go home and rest because I need you in 8 hours. Like, please leave and go home and rest. So that's something that you have to consider. You have to understand how your teammates work. If you have someone that's like this, you need to tell them to stop and go home. And this is the challenge. You can't stop the sun. It's Tom Petty for those trying to figure out where the quote's from. But it's true, right? At some point, the sun's going to keep turning. Time keeps going on. And so if you have everyone working all night, who's going to answer the phone tomorrow morning? That was a big concern for us, so that's why we sent people home. So the other role you can do as far as protecting your engineers from all of this data floating around, another music quote, kind of shielding and filtering the conversation coming in from outside their group. We still want to have conversation and communication inside your team, but I'm sure a lot of people experience that when there's a problem, now all the executives want to know what's going on, all the employees want to know what's going on if you're internally focused, your customers are going to want to know what's going on if you're an externally focused company. As the leader, you're kind of filtering all of that. Even as those engineers that go home and might think of something and say, oh, let me just make sure I pass on this information, the incident commander should be the point of contact for that. They can filter the information for relevancy and answer the important questions without all of their engineers being stuck in a shallow, interrupted work cycle when they're trying to solve major business crises. You want to shield them from that interruption. So customer facing. Right? There's going to be a level of public communication you have as well. So again, I don't think necessarily the leader has to be the person in these roles, but because you're heading up this group, you get to set the tone on how things are done. So it's important to understand just the ways that are good to communicate. I think it's best to communicate quickly. I don't know what's worse than banging my head against a problem for 2 hours just to find out that it was an outage that didn't quite get reported. That's frustrating. So especially if you're customer facing and you know about outages and issues, they're best to report instantly. We did this with our client. As soon as we found the problem, we called them and let them know. That way they don't have people trying to work, log in and access files and can't for hours at a time getting frustrated. They knew what the problem was right away. I love status page updates. because they let you know what's happening in real time. You can subscribe to changes. This is just a simple, you should probably consider doing this if you're not, even internally. It goes a long way to stop the, what's the status now? What's the status now? What's the status now? What's the status now? You say, here is a website, please subscribe to updates, and now you hopefully don't have to talk to this person the rest of the day. So that's just a big way to just shave off some of that additional communication that you're doing that's taking away from bringing things back up online. Honesty is a big one. I think it's hard, especially when something goes wrong and it's your fault. We want to be blameless, but let's be a little bit real. At least you're going to want to own that internally, right? You feel like it was your fault. I think the Gliffy incident was about a year ago, and GitLab was just about a month or two ago. And they owned that right away. They had a production engineer accidentally delete databases. And it happened in both cases. But what they didn't do was hide the issue. They didn't blame anyone else. They didn't sort of pretend like something was wrong and we don't know what. They both came out and owned the issue right away and said, yeah, this is what happened. We made a mistake. Here's what we're doing to fix it. So it's stressful because you're going to be worried that everyone blames you and thinks you're terrible for it, which might be the case. But what we've seen is that honesty comes back and gets rewarded. This is all from the GitLab incident. What happened was everyone really identified with those engineers who were in that situation. I mean, how many haven't made mistakes in their career at some point? Right? At some point, you've done something terrible. I worked for a manager who used to do IT for executive branch. And he, at one point, took out every single computer in a war room. Right? He tried to make changes. He tried to automate some stuff with like old school Active Directory changes and deleted the entire system directory on all of these systems in a war room. So yeah, that was fun, but he owned his mistake and he fixed it because he knew what the problem was. So getting that happening and owning up to it, you get a better response than if you hide it. People are going to find out what happened anyway. It's better just to come out and be forward with that. So here's the other side of that. Once everything is cleaned up, you need to make sure, this goes back to my concept of ritual. You want to end crisis mode at some point, or everyone keeps functioning that way. I think it's important, again, to have this small ritual around that. Say, hey, we've cleaned up what needs to be done in this crisis mode. I'm no longer incident commander for this. I am going back to whatever role it was I had before. We can continue to function normally. You should have takeaways. There should be stuff that's left to do, because there's probably things that can happen during normal business hours that don't have to happen during a crisis. But it's important to make sure there's a moment where it stops being a crisis. We can go back to it. We should come back later and post-mortem it all, but we still want to end that moment. So this is a lot of information. A lot of it's what works for me. A lot of it's what worked for our team, but I think there's good points here in general that can be applied overall. Obviously, you're going to know your teams and your environment better than I am because you work with them every day. So take what applies and change what's good for you. But regardless of what we're talking about, whether it's being a servant leader or being clear communicators, this is the overall gist of the incident commander. Your goal is not necessarily to do a specific task or take care of all of the problems. Your goal is to make sure your team can really be the best that they can be. Your goal here is not necessarily to execute your own personal vision on this, but to make sure your team can solve the problem, execute the collective vision that's there as efficiently as possible. Remove the barriers and distractions that are going to stop them from that. So that's my thoughts on what it takes to be a leader during a fire. Thank you very much.
All right, we got time for 3 to 5 questions.
Who has a question? Raise your hand, everybody.
Everyone just wants to know when lunch is.
Question?
Is there a threshold of the limit of incidents someone could be the incident commander before that becomes their full-time job?
I think this goes pretty strongly into your mileage may vary. If your organization is very small, you might not have a choice of how many incidents they're doing. You probably shouldn't be in a situation where you have so many incidents that 8 hours out of every day someone is being an incident commander. That might indicate other problems that need to be fixed. So it's going to depend on your organization, but that's the best advice I can give you.
What kind of framework do you have to determine when an issue or when an incident is a crisis?
It's usually impacts. How urgent and impact. We actually have taken that pretty clearly from the ITIL models of urgency. So if it's high impact, high urgency, it's usually a crisis automatically. Anything else in there is going to be felt out a little bit in a little bit of gray area, but those are the main things.
How do you get people offline to sleep? Like, seriously, how do you get them offline? They're attached to their phone, they're attached to multiple devices at home, they have access to the code repo from anywhere in the world. How do you actually take your devs offline?
So in one instance, I have literally confiscated their work laptop, but it's hard because there's only so much you can force another person to do in a nice way. I have strongly encouraged it. I have sort of blocked them from interacting before, but hopefully if you say, I need you to go home and sleep, and they recognize that they're tired by the time they get home and sit down, they can make those choices, but at a certain point, they've got to make a choice for themselves, and there's only so much you can do to encourage it.